Hello and welcome to the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. My name is Claudia Rizzini. I am the Executive Director of the Fellowship Program. The Radcliffe Institute brings together students, scholars, and practitioners from across disciplines and professions to create and share transformative ideas. You can participate in this laboratory of ideas by attending public programs such as this one, visiting virtual exhibitions, or pursuing the special collections held at the Schlesinger Library. To learn more about Radcliffe, please feel free to sign up to receive information on news and events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. We'll begin the program with a presentation by Will Mackin. After the presentation, the speaker will respond to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time throughout the program. We ask that you keep your questions brief to allow us to address as many as possible in the time that we have together. It is my pleasure to introduce this year Perrin Moorhead Grayson and Burns Grayson Fellow Will Mackin. His first book, Bring Out the Dog, won the Penn Robert Bingham Prize for Debut Short Story Collection. The stories are based on his 23-year service in the US Navy. The judges of the Penn Bingham Prize concluded that, quote, Mackin's fiction situates the reader in the headspace of an elite soldier who records the realities and irrealities of contemporary warfare, as well as the most heartless and hurtful eruptions of human nature on both sides, with an audacious infrared clarity, end quote. Will joined the Navy after graduating from the University of Colorado, Boulder. Early in his career, he served as a Pentagon speechwriter and an Olmsted Scholar, which is the military equivalent of the Rhodes Scholar. He served in Iraq and Afghanistan, first as a navigator aboard a carrier-based jet, then as a joint terminal attack controller attached to a SEAL team. Will Mackin's writing has appeared in The Atlantic, GQ, The New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, and Teen House. His short story, Catacomb, was included in the Best American Short Stories in 2014. Will played a DIA agent in episode 507 of Breaking Bad. Following that appearance, he wrote an essay, which is published in GQ and was nominated for an American Society of Magazine Editors Ellie Award. In 2019, on the Moth main stage, he told a story called The Danger Zone, about a close call with a chain-smoking flight instructor, former prisoner of war. He interviewed on New Yorker Radio Hour, MSNBC, Morning Joe, and other media outlets. At Radcliffe, Will is writing Animals, a collection of short stories based on his experience as a special operations soldier in Iraq and Afghanistan. Each story will be centered around an encounter between a soldier and a member or members of the animal kingdom. In particular, he will explore the similarities and differences between soldiers and animals in terms of survival instinct, pack mentality, reactions to stimuli, and exercise or illusion of free will, with a goal to add a fresh perspective to the idea of war as a uniquely human enterprise. And now it is my pleasure to give the virtual floor to Will Mackin.
Thank you, Claudia, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the Radcliffe Institute for this opportunity. I'd also like to thank my fellow fellows in the audience. It's my pleasure to spend this year with you in your good company. Okay, as Claudia mentioned, I spent over 20 years on active duty in the United States Navy. And during that time, I kept a journal. In the journal, I'd record things that struck me, mostly sights, sounds, images. Every once in a while, I would go through and try to give context to those things that I included in the journal. And you see some pictures on the screen here in the intro slide, some things that made the cut. Barbecue at Al Asad, which was in Iraq. There's what was called a giant hole out in the middle of Iraq on patrol that we circled with chem lights so we wouldn't drive into it. Down in the bottom left is a piece of farm equipment that was outside of a compound in Afghanistan. So these types of things that I just thought of, I put into my journal. And later when I retired, the things in my journal plus my memories were very disjointed. There wasn't really any context to them. There wasn't much perspective to them. So when I sat down to write, my job was really to kind of take these things mostly in memory form, but I'd also go back to my journals and kind of look and see kind of place and time and space where these things happen, and try to turn that jumble into something with narrative context to it. So my goal today is I'm going to try to describe to you my process and how I went about doing that for my first book, which presumably would be the same process for my second book, which I've begun worked on. I mean, I've been working on for probably about 1.5 years now, but it's still in its very early stages. And so the way I thought I would describe this is by using the template of a military operational brief. And because everything in the military has an acronym, the operational brief does as well, and it's called the SMEAC. And so SMEAC is also a mnemonic. It stands for Situation, Mission, Execution, Admin Logistics, and Command and Control. A commander of a unit will develop a SMEAC brief in response to short notice tasking. It usually happens at an outpost or maybe even in the field. There's not a whole lot of time to plan. So it just hits the highlights. The goal is really to build the situational awareness of everybody in the unit as to what's about to happen, and to assign tasking as best we can. And so my plan today is to go through the SMEAC, each element. I'll give you some context in which each element means in a military brief, and also try to talk to it my interpretation artistically and how I'm going to use this to describe my project. And the big takeaway really for the SMEAC brief is it's not a detailed plan. It's very much a plan to deviate from, which makes it perfect for the unpredictable nature of combat, but also it kind of fits a work of fiction in its very early stages. So beginning with situation. Militarily, what I'd be talking about here are forces, friendly forces, enemy forces, their positions on the battlefield, their numbers, and their capabilities. Artistically, though, situation or forces are more psychological in nature. And for that, I'm going back to the things that I put in my journal or my memories, things that occur to me that I can't seem to forget, that I kind of obsess over. And these types of forces, these impressions or influences are hard to break out in terms of friendly or enemy. But my criteria for the friendly side was anything that gave context to my work. And so I came up with 2 of them. 2 influences, matter of fact. The first one is the novel Animal Farm by George Orwell. And the second is the album Animals by Pink Floyd. And so I encountered both these works as a freshman in high school in the early 1980s. And they both appealed to me immediately for their distrust of authority, since I am a Gen Xer, and also their revolutionary vibe. So early 1980s in English class, we were assigned Animal Farm. And it was taught to us that it was a critique of Stalinism. And at the time, this was the fever pitch of the Cold War. A few years prior, I'd seen the Miracle on Ice happen at the Olympics, where the American hockey team had defeated the Soviet hockey team. More recently, I'd watched The Day After on TV, which dramatized a nuclear holocaust, a nuclear war between the 2 superpowers and its aftermath. And as a 14-year-old, I believed President Reagan's characterization of the Soviet Union as an evil empire. But that changed after reading Animal Farm. I could see how it hadn't started that way, how there really were there was some purity of thought behind it, that they were trying to create a more just and equitable society. And Orwell dramatized that in his narrative, using his animals. Pink Floyd, the album, functions a little bit differently for me. I wasn't assigned it. It was something I came across and I liked it. I just like the sound of it. I love David Gilmour's guitar solos and Roger Waters' voice and his lyrics. But this album, it's often described as a critique of capitalism. So it functions kind of in the same way Animal Farm did. But it describes a very bleak world where greed and apathy are the dominant emotions. In fact, the opening lines begin, if you didn't care what happened to me, and I didn't care for you. The rest of the album goes on to describe a world void of caring or empathy. And this reminds me of a quote from the writer George Saunders, who said, a story in which nobody is wearing pants is ultimately a story in praise of pants. And so this album, as I listen to it now as an adult, functions in that way. It is a story of empathy. And I hope to kind of do the same thing in my project, my next book. Okay, so while friendly forces give context, enemy forces do the opposite. They create confusion. And so the two I've selected to talk about are, first and foremost, our practice of taking detainees and our treatment of those detainees, also called enemy prisoners of war. But we didn't call them that, and we were careful not to call them that. There were several euphemisms that we used officially, and those euphemisms bled down unofficially. But we called them detainees, persons under control, enemy combatants. And the reason for that is because we wanted to avoid having to treat them as it's lined out in the Geneva Convention. So the Geneva Convention details a list of rights that prisoners of war should be granted. And by calling them something else, we circumvented those rights, which is shameful in my opinion. But one of the aspects, or actually paradoxically, the strange thing about this is before the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, early 1990s, I had just graduated flight school, and I was assigned to a jet whose mission was to fly behind enemy lines. And for any crew member of an aircraft that flies behind enemy lines, you have to go through training called SEER. And some of you might have heard about SEER before. It's another acronym, and it stands for survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. And so during the survival phase of training, we're all taken out into the woods. In my case, it was California, let loose and just to live for 2 or 3 days on what's available to us. So no equipment. It'd be as if we ejected from an aircraft. What we had in our flight suit basically was what we had in the woods in California. And so we learned useful things like which bugs to eat, which bugs not to eat. We learned how to purify water. So that's the survival phase. In the evasion phase, the drama steps up a little bit. The instructors give us a destination several miles away in the woods, which we're supposed to reach in a certain amount of time. They give us a head start, and then they chase us and they try to capture us. Not as fun as it sounds. But during this phase, like we are just learning how to evade capture. But eventually we all are captured. And when we're captured, we're brought back to a mock prison camp. And in this camp is where we undergo mock interrogation. So this is where kind of the reality is blurred a little bit. We're all sleep deprived. We're now in this camp. They're sleep depriving us further, and they're using what they call, at the time, accelerated techniques. One of which was to put us in a very small cells in which we're cramped and folded, and we spend a long time in there. And I'm not trying to make this sound like it's anything comparable to the real thing, being an actual prisoner. I'm just trying to describe the situation. And so while we're folded into these little boxes, they play at top volume what I call the crying baby tape. So this is kind of a psychological warfare. It's a way to disorient us and to kind of get in our heads, and it was very effective. The tape itself begins with a baby in its crib, and it's kind of fussing. It starts to cry out and gets no response. The cries get more desperate, and eventually the baby is screaming, and it's screaming to the point where you wonder if, it thinks it's the only living being left on earth trying to hear itself scream. The screams get to the point where they're distorted in the audio, and they last for a very long time. The tape itself, maybe start to finish, is 8-9 minutes, but they replay it over and over and over and over. And so anyway, I was exposed to this during SEER school. Years later, when I'm with a SEAL team in Iraq and Afghanistan, part of our mission is to go out and find these leaders of terrorist networks. And if we find them, we bring them back and we hand them over to interrogators. The interrogators have the detention facilities are co-located with our camps in many cases. And to soften up the detainees for interrogation, they would play the same tape. So the irony there was not lost on me. And again, it's not as affecting to hear it basically as a member of the team, or as on the side that's playing it versus the side that's listening to it. But it still has effects. And so this is one of the main thrusts of the narrative that I'm hoping to incorporate into the drama. So one third, or a third aspect of situation are neutral forces. And this is where I kind of see the animals fitting in. Every night when we went out on target, when we went out on a mission, we would encounter animals on the way to the target, on the way back, on the target itself. It's always at nighttime, and we're always wearing night vision. One of the first things that struck me about this is the eyes. So we'd routinely see bulls, goats, pigs on occasion, donkeys. And on night vision, their eyes have a reflectivity. You could look at them and you could tell that they were thinking, what are you doing here? And so seeing them think that made me wonder, yeah, what am I doing here? But just for a minute, I snapped back into what I was supposed to do. But it was just that interaction that makes me think about, or makes me reflect on a lot of things. And they're kind of the mechanism of that reflection. So that pretty much covers situation. If this were a real military brief, I would have laid down like exactly where all the forces were, the state of play. And next I would get into mission, which details the who, what, why, when, and where, or what we call the 5 W's. Okay, so for mission, I'm going to show you this, this slide here up in the upper left. That's the actual notebook that I carried with me out on missions, and it was waterproof for a reason. We often had to cross rivers, and or it was raining or whatever, and I needed to be able to read what I had written down, so I used that grease pencil that's tucked away there. On the right side are my notes from an actual SMEAC brief on the mission portion, the who, what, why, when, and where. And I'll step through them here briefly so you can understand what's happening. The middle column, the collection of letters and numbers there, those are abbreviated call signs for aircraft. And that's the who and also the what. Each aircraft had its own capabilities, some of which are classified and I can't get into. But that's the who and the what. The when is on the left-hand side. Those are on station times. So when the aircraft is actually going to be overhead and available for tasking, and they all overlap. So this, let me get into the where is on the right side there. Those numbers correspond to altitudes. So 270 is 27,000 feet. 230 to 250, that's a block, 23,000 to 25,000. So that was probably at least two aircraft together, and they just want to split their formation vertically. So and it goes down from there. The very bottom, the SE-02 was the gunship, and every night we would have what's called the AC-130 gunship. It carried a howitzer, it carried a bunch of other armament. It was very low and very lethal. So these are the elements when I'm talking about, say, a narrative. I'm trying to convert, okay, how does a mission part of a SMEAC become a narrative? These are the things that I can reach out and touch and control, basically. So the way I interpret that fictionally is with character, and behind the characters are stories. I already told you a little bit about the crying baby and how that's going to factor in, but really what I'm interested in with that is how the tape came to be made at all. Like what's its origin story? Beyond that, what did the parents know, about this tape being made? And lastly, what became of the baby? Like the baby, the tape was probably made in the 50s. It was a reel-to-reel originally. That's what they played at SEER, was the reel-to-reel. So by the time the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are happening, the baby's probably in its 60s or 70s. So I just wonder, like, that's the arc, the narrative arc of the story of the baby that I want to tell. The family, this includes just not only the family of the baby, the parents, but also the protagonist as a young man, and also the protagonist as a father and husband. And the cycle there is, the deployment cycle, going to war and coming home. That creates the conflict and the tension. Down to the animals, I'll just highlight a couple of these here. But they all have their stories, many of which came out of when I was writing my first book. These were stories that were left over that I couldn't quite finish or put together, and I'm hoping to do so with this project. But pigs, for instance. Prior to every deployment, the entire team would undergo what was called live tissue training. And this was medical training. And we used live pigs to do this training. So the pigs were sedated, heavily sedated, and then they were given injuries, traumatic injuries. And we had to use what would be available to us on a mission, the medical supplies that we had on hand, to stabilize the pig and theoretically get it on the Casevac, which would take it to a hospital with more robust capability. So that was the goal of the training. It was taken very seriously. It was a very somber occasion. And because we had all lived through this with human beings, with people that we knew and cared for. And so the instructors for this course of training were all injured veterans. One time I had a guy who had been hit with an IED. And he had lost an arm, and he also had traumatic brain injury, and he would speak very slowly, very methodically. And so he came over when I was working on my pig and kind of knelt down, and he's like, he asked me if I knew what I was doing. Of course, I said no. He then stepped me through each organ. He was taking me through, like, okay, this is the pancreas, this is the stomach, these are the lungs. And he got to the heart. And he pulled the pig's heart out. The pig was still alive. And I held the heart in my hand and felt it beating. And I felt it stop. And that was, to get at the empathy here, I rarely feel my own heartbeat. I don't think anybody does. Even if I climb a flight of stairs, it's only for a few seconds maybe that I'm aware of it. But for hours after that, I felt my own heartbeat. And this is the empathy that I'm talking about, that I want to bring into the stories. Yeah, I'm running out of time, so I'll just move on from there. But so the characters, they each have stories. It's not necessarily a cohesive narrative when I put them all together. So in the execution phase, which militarily discuss how, like, how are you going to take these elements of the mission and employ them effectively? And so the how for me, well, militarily here, I'll just show you very quickly. On the left, this is my stack. These are the aircraft that would be overhead on the mission. On the right, this is the template that I would use to employ those aircraft. So if you think about it, they're all in a stack. They can't just descend and climb within because there's a risk of having a midair collision and just creates a lot of confusion and chaos. And so using this template, I could deconflict in time and space, run multiple attacks simultaneously while deconflicting with the stack. Execution for a work of fiction. Now imagine you're on top of the stack looking down, and these are the characters in the orbit of the stack. The baby would be the highest in the orbit. It would have the widest orbit. And when I think about theme, I think in terms of cycles. And for the baby, it's the cycle of the tape itself. It goes from comfort to despair to terror to static, and then repeats. And the family, as I mentioned, with the protagonist as well, his father is also a veteran of Vietnam. And so that family is constantly running through a cycle of war and home. And then at the center are the animals. And this is the anchor of the story. This is where I hope that the emotional heft will come from. Okay, so on to admin and logistics. In a military setting, what we would discuss here are rules and limits. So rules of engagement, rules pertaining to the handling of detainees, limits pertaining to different aircraft, like the gunship that I described earlier, which is the lowest in the stack that has the howitzer gun. It's not allowed to fly during certain periods. It can only take off 30 minutes after sunset. It needs to be back on the ground 30 minutes prior to sunrise. And those rules can be broken, but you have to know who to talk to and how to break them. But for fiction, the rules really don't apply. And that's what I aspire to, but that's not always what happens. So I imposed initially, when I was writing my first book, I imposed very strict rules upon myself in that I wanted it to be nonfiction first. And secondly, I wanted it to be a true reflection of what happened. And by that, I mean, I wanted everybody that was with me to read it and acknowledge it as a true and representative copy of what happened, for lack of a better term. And that was impossible. I mean, I would finish some stories and I would send them to friends, guys that I knew were with me when these things happened. And they would remember it as happening in a different season, in a different year, in a different country. And so it was very unreliable, especially when it came to fact checking some of these stories. But what that told me was, and I should have realized it sooner, but I wanted, like, the intensity of our experience kind of brought me to that place. And so I had to break through that. And I did, luckily, after probably 2.5 years of writing and 4 years total. And so once I opened myself up to allowing things to be fictionalized, to be made up, to take something that happened in a different place and time with something else that happened in a different place and time, put them together, made it a lot easier for me. So hopefully that will continue. Last thing is command and control. And for this, in a military briefing, we'd be talking about communication. We'd be talking, first of all, command is the command structure, the chain of command, who makes the decisions, how you can reach them. And the control part is, of course, the comms, mostly radio comms. So going into my experience, on the left here is from the notebook. Again, it's what we call the Comm Wheel. It corresponds to a dial on top of the radio so that each detent is a separate, discrete frequency with a separate audience. And the way it worked was nighttime, you can't like flash a light down and look down at your radio. You have to know by clicks who you're talking to. And so that's what the Comm Wheel is there. What my military experience taught me really was kind of my MFA, was my role as a communicator in the military. When I was flying, it was very important, especially around the ship. You had to say exactly what needed to be said, when it needed to be said. And you had to say it in such a way that inspired confidence. That was multiplied when I became a JTAC on the other end. Now I'm on the ground talking to the aircraft. I had to not only project comm, but know what I was talking about, say things when they needed to be said, anticipate questions, describe the situation. There was a back and forth between me and a pilot on any attack where it's called the talk on, where I would describe to him or her the target, and we would come to a mutual agreement that we were looking at the same thing. And that was very intensive. You have to be precise, you have to be brief. And so this is kind of where I learned my voice, is in communicating on the radio, talking to pilots as a JTAC, talking to controllers as a navigator. And so let's see, I've got 5 minutes left. What I'd like to do on the last part here of voice is just kind of read you a excerpt from my first book that I really think, when I was writing this, I thought very much about the voice, because your voice is really your credibility in the military. And so this scene describes a SMEAC brief. It's set in Iraq at an outpost. It's a SEAL team being briefed by their commander. His name is JJ. Their second in command, his name is Spot. JJ gives, like I just gave to you, the SMEAC brief, the wave top stuff, but then Spot stands up and really delivers what's up. And so without further ado, I'll just jump right into it. A caged bulb, the kind you'd hang off the hood of your car while doing a tune-up, lit the briefing hut. We sat under the light on rows of wooden benches. A white bed sheet, which functioned as our projector screen, hung at the front of the room. JJ turned on the projector, squinted against the light. "We're going back to heat," he said, using the Iraqi pronunciation for hit. Then he talked us through the slideshow. The helicopters would drop us off at the train station around midnight. From there, we'd walk across the tracks and toward the Euphrates on a perpendicular road. We'd take a right this time. Our target was a 4-story building on a corner. Actions on target, or those steps taken to kill or capture our enemies within, were standard. We'd pull detainees as necessary and exfil southeast. Now JJ pointed his laser off the bedsheet, circling a spot on the plywood wall beyond. Out there, we'd find an area with no tank traps, sinkholes, or barbed wire, where the helos could safely touch down. The last slide said simply, questions. There were none. JJ closed the brief and a white light projected onto the bedsheet. Spot stood up in that light, his lower lip packed with chew. He spit into a paper cup and said, "All right, how to put this?" Events of the last mission had convinced him that things were getting a little too loose, not just with laser discipline, although dudes were still lighting up every moth and bunny rabbit in the shadows. And not only with bullshit on the radio, case in point, last night's reading of War and Peace over Troop Comment, but with actions on target, with our bread and fucking butter. And although he shouldn't have to reiterate our philosophy, Spot felt the need. Speed and violence, he said, and we allowed him to say it again. How many times had his ass and the asses of others been saved by those two elements working in concert? The answer was unknown and unknowable. We knew that. As the reigning world champions of speed and violence, we knew. So to go in doing one thing without the other, or neither, or to go in half-assed, Jesus. Dust motes followed Spot as he paced in the light of the projector beam. Nicotine entered his bloodstream through the thinnest of membranes on the inside of his lip. His wayward eye was humming. These people, Spot would have us know, were trying to kill us. Example, Habaniya. Example, Ramadi. Example, Al-Qaim. Goddamn Qaim in particular, with its remnants of the Republican Guard. Imagine had we not reacted like unconscious banshees there. Imagine if zero shits and zero fucks had not been given. Spot savored a fresh influx of nicotine, affording us time to imagine what we'd reflexively survived at Qaim, which I tried. I really did. Okay, so with that, I'll conclude my SMEAC brief. And hopefully I clarified my process a little bit to you. I know it was clarifying to me, and I appreciate having done it. I'll leave you with the thought that the SMEAC is just a plan. And as such, it's not going to survive initial contact with the enemy. Or as Mike Tyson says, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And with that, I'll hand it over to Claudia.
Thank you, Will. This was a great presentation. Thank you so much. As you can imagine, we have questions. We have a lot of them. So let's move on to them, please. So the first one is from a public radio reporter who aims to report from for Afghanistan and Iraq vets. This person is asking, do you think the embedded strategy makes sense? And are there journalists who report on war whose work you admire?
Good question. Yes, I think the embedded model makes sense. I'm a big fan of Michael Herr's Dispatches. It's one of the first things about war that I read that really resonated with me. I'd say beyond him, I don't know of anyone else that I could say has influenced me with that reportage, but I understand that it's very important. We had some people with us on the team, but because our missions were generally more dangerous, they weren't allowed to come along, but they hung out at the camps, and it was a good sounding board, if anything else, to find somebody outside of the system and sit down and have a conversation. But thank you for your question.
Yeah. Is writing an act of reconciliation for you? Who was struck by the anti-authoritarian ideas of Orwell's Animal House early on, but then became a career military officer?
Yeah, that's the story of my life. I don't know. But it's, I joined the Navy because I needed money for college. That's what it boiled down to. I wanted to go away to school, and I didn't have money to do it. The Navy offered this opportunity. I also wanted to fly. I saw Top Gun and had these ideas of myself as Maverick, which I understand is very cheesy, but regardless, when I got into the Navy and I realized that it was something completely different, my father wasn't in, my grandparents were in, but it was a very different situation. They were in World War II. And so I didn't really have a model. I didn't really know what I was getting into beyond the cheesy movies that I was watching. What kept me in, though, was, and you hear this from a lot of vets, but it was the people that I worked with, the mission that felt important, that I felt like I was a part of something bigger than myself. These are all things that vets say over and over, but it really is true. I miss that now as a retiree. But thank you for your question.
So what was the most helpful in crossing the bridge to feel able to write fiction from these experiences?
Most helpful was definitely being able to make connections that I would not have been able to make in nonfiction. So, for example, there is a story in my book about crossing a river. And in real life, we crossed a river and we had somebody fall in, and as they fell in, they screamed out, they cursed as they went underwater. And this reminded me of a story by Isaac Babel called Crossing the Rivers, Zubrik, I think it's pronounced, where in the very early parts of that story, somebody falls into a river and curses the Mother of God. And so I had that connection in my head. Another connection that when I thought about that, the reality of that and the story of that would occur to me is this football game that I played as a junior in high school. It was a championship game and we won on a trick play. And so that occurred, those thoughts, like in nonfiction, I couldn't make the connection, but in fiction, I was able to kind of connect those things and tell the story that I thought my subconscious was trying to tell me, but that I was resisting because it didn't make sense.
Yeah. Can you offer a particular example of how one of these critters makes an appearance in one of your stories and how it represents the animal theme that you are targeting in this collection?
Sure. So I'll go with a story that I've already written because the other ones aren't complete yet. But the story from which the title of my book comes, Bring Out the Dog, is about the death of one of our military working dogs. It happened the first night of my third deployment to Afghanistan, so probably around 2008. And it was what's called a blue on blue. It was one of our guys that shot the dog. It was an accident. And it was tragic. It was a horrible way to start a deployment. But anyway, that played out in a way. We had a memorial for the dog, and we sent it home. We had it buried. We gave it awards. All the things that we would do with a member of our team, exactly as we would behave with a member of our team. And so the animal there, the dog, the obvious function is just reflecting on how or what, I guess, constitutes teamwork, what constitutes that loyalty. And the dog definitely had earned that from us. And so in that story, I was trying to explore that relationship.
Another member of the audience says, I liked your comment about voice in the military, and I was curious if you felt like your writing helped you further develop your voice. Can you speak a little about how and when you first became interested in literature? So 2 questions.
Yeah, 2 questions. So I'll start with the last one. I became interested in the 6th grade. I had a fantastic English teacher. Her name was Mrs. Miller. She recently retired. I'm still in touch with her. But she assigned us a story. Well, actually, she assigned us The Outsiders, and by S.E. Hinton. So reading The Outsiders, she illustrated it by bringing in, one day she brought in a boombox with the Who's Baba O'Reilly, and she played that song and related it kind of to the struggle of the greasers. And because that song was very much in play at the time, it was very much part of what I felt was the real world and my interaction in it, just socially with my friends. It struck a chord. Like that was a very cool way to illustrate that. And after that, I mean, she turned me on to Kurt Vonnegut, and it was that's all she wrote. After that, I wanted to tell stories, and I wanted to tell them in a way that affected me the same way that these
had. How do you know what you can share and what you can't? Do you get approval before sharing your experiences when writing nonfiction?
I don't get approval, and that's another thing that fiction helped with. I don't come anywhere near the line where I would expose tactics or procedures or people. my characters are all mixes of a bunch of different characters, although everybody seems to want to be the main SEAL character in the book. The friends that I'm still in touch with, the first thing they said when the book came out was, "I'm Hal, right?" They want to be the hero. But I mean, other than that, I steer very clear of that line and make it as fuzzy as possible when I approach it.
Yeah, understandable. How has your fiction been received by the community of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans in your personal life and more broadly?
So personally, I mean, my friends tell me that they like it. I don't believe them necessarily all the time, but there are people that nitpick, that just say, you know, these things are impossible. These things never happened, or call me a poser, or I don't know. These are the things that would have bothered me had I not made that shift to fiction. So the thing is, just you're not going to please everybody. There are people that absolutely love it. There are people that absolutely hate it. I think they're both right.
Absolutely. Which war authors do you consider yourself writing in the shadow of, if any? And what do you think of writers who are critical of wars, like Wilfred Owen?
That's a good question. I think you can still be critical of it and describe it in an entertaining way. At least that's what I try to do. I try not to come down on one side or the other. In fact, the quote at the beginning of my book is from Barry Hannah, who's one of those authors that really affected me. And he says, "We saw victory and defeat, and they were both wonderful." That was very true in my experience. That was what I tried to portray when writing stories. And it's Barry Hannah's story. It's called Midnight and I'm Not Famous Yet. It's one of the most, I'd say, affecting stories that I've ever read. I love the voice of it, and I hear the voice of it. When I'm writing myself, it's what I aspire to. When I can hear my story in his voice, then I know I'm onto something.
Yeah. You mentioned empathy as a central focus in your collection. What would you like the reader to empathize with?
So here, that's a good question too. I don't know what I have in mind for the reader. What I want to do is describe an empathetic situation that hopefully that the reader can relate to. So some of these experiences are very, you know, rarefied, or at least they're very stereotypical. And like it's not that I want to approach everything from the SEAL perspective, but the way that those wars were fought, they were both, and I'm speaking of Iraq and Afghanistan, very special operations centric. So much of the action was carried out by special operations. And so it's a very small community in the Navy, in the Army, in the Air Force. Everybody tends to know each other. And because of the tempo, we got a lot of repetition. And it's also not very well described. I know there's movies about it. I know there's books about it. I know all that stuff, but none of them feel right. They're still kind of it strikes kind of a false note, at least for me. And so what I'm trying to do is present this as a more human endeavor. Like, these aren't superheroes. These aren't, to lack of a better term, to kind of humanize.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Do you know if anyone in Iraq or Afghanistan gotten to read your books?
I don't know if anybody has, but I would be very interested to hear what they had to say.
Mm-hmm. You said in an interview that you went from SEAL to ROTC, and that gave you a chip on your shoulder. The chip fueled your drive to write your first book. After winning awards and getting critical acclaim, does that chip still fuel your writing?
It doesn't, and actually it was something I had to get over. if I said it fueled my writing in my interview, then I was lying, because really it was an impediment. And it was not just an impediment to writing, it was an impediment to life, because I couldn't function. There was at the time, I don't know if there still is, but there's a very kind of resentful feeling in the team when it comes to civilians, or even when it comes to other military that perhaps don't deploy as much or as frequently or do as dangerous a mission. And so that, regrettably, that seeped into me. And when I went to ROTC, which is, I call the land of make-believe. I mean, nothing is real. Almost nothing has any impact. It's all training. It's all safe zone. And it was a shock. And so it really brought that chip out in me, and it was not good. And so I had to chip away at that over time. I think the stories helped, because you can't write a story with a chip on your shoulder. It comes off as just like yelling through a megaphone. It's obnoxious. And I saw in my first drafts that that's what was happening, and kind of came to terms with it on my own. It wasn't, I don't have PTSD. I don't thankfully suffer from anything like that. But, my struggle was just trying not to be an asshole, to put it in stark terms. And every degree that I calmed the heck down from that, I think made me a better writer.
We have notes expressing appreciation for your service and for your efforts to share your experience. So just wanted to note that. One more question. I love seeing your journals. Was there a point in your writing process where you became aware that you were writing for an audience as opposed to writing for yourself?
Yes, there was a point in that. And that was when I was writing my first story, the one that got published first. It's called Catacoping. And it was it's very much based on real events. It was a nonfiction story initially. I went to the Tin House Writing Workshop and workshopped that story as nonfiction there. And I realized that what was making it not work was it wasn't relatable. And one of the things that fiction brought to that story that made it more relatable was one of the characters is Dutch, and he receives these packages from his mother. He's in the American military. This is all factual. He's like a 7.5 foot tall Dutchman, was in the Army, and he was with us on our outpost. And he would get these packages from his mom with these candies in them called Catacoping, which are licorice. They're horrible. My apologies to any Dutch people in the audience, but they are horrible. Anyway, he didn't even eat them. His mom thought he liked them. And so this was kind of the story. There was a drama that happens in the background, kind of centering around this character. But it wasn't until I added some stamps as like little cutouts of Bruegel paintings, a Dutch painter, and kind of that really brought that story to a more relatable level. And it wasn't just like tactics, us moving here and there now. Now it had a little bit more meaning behind it. I think that's really when I realized that I needed to do that.
So in your new book, how will you incorporate concerns about military war crimes and make real the many war crimes in all our fields and battles?
So my hope is, as much as I'm going to address that, to do that through the Crying Baby tape, and to try and bring the story of the creation of the tape itself and how it was originally imagined to be used, how it was actually used. I don't really have a good answer there, other than that's my way in. Like, I haven't figured it out yet.
I think we have time for one more question, which is, did you ever feel the impulse to include drawings in your published fiction?
I did, and it's a good thing I didn't because I'm not very good at drawing.
No.
But some of them, like one story, the one I talked about with the dog that we lost on that first night. We were at an outpost near Kandahar, and there was this this reservoir where all the waste from the toilets was dumped into, and every once in a while they'd pour diesel on it, light it on fire, and it would evaporate into the air and form clouds, and then it would rain shit. And so this was kind of like the backdrop to that very happy and hopeful story. But what got me thinking about that, well, not just the fact that I had to walk through shitstorms every now and then, was the fact that, like, how a weather cycle worked. And I drew that in my journal one time. I was in Helmand in a valley between these mountains, and actually, like, had time to sit there and watch a storm kind of form and start raining. And so I drew that. I drew the little cycle of the evaporation and condensation and rain. And looking at that, that's what got me into that dog story. I saw that and I was like, okay, now I know how to describe the shit.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Will, for your thoughtful presentation and for your perspectives. We've learned a lot about your creative process today. I also want to thank you, our audience, for the terrific questions. I hope you'll be able to join for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find out about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. And with that, thank you again for joining us today, and have a good rest of the day.